Hey guys, Tom Barclay here. Just want to do a video off the back of Ange Postecoglou's latest interview with Mark Schwarzer and also reflecting on Tottenham's financial results and Daniel Levy's comments after it. But first of all, an interview that Ange has done with Mark Schwarzer, the old Chelsea and Premier League and Australia goalkeeper, with Optus Sports, the Australia TV broadcaster, and a couple of lines that I found really interesting from it. First of all, he talked about how he thinks it's fair to say, and no doubt, that a large part of the Tottenham fan base have lost faith with what the team are doing, and therefore his methods, which was a real frank admission. Ange has been doing that many times over the years during his time at Spurs, so it's not completely surprising, but still to have it sort of laid bare in that way, how he feels, he's up against it and trying to win them back over, was quite a starting admission. He said that he could understand how people sort of saw progress last year, but how it hadn't manifested itself this season. But how he still feels, bullish over the prospects of this squad, which he talked about before, and what can still happen. He pointed towards the Europa League as a chance to sort of turn it all around. But to have him speak in such a way about how things are going did sort of point to the frustrations and the difficulties that he's going through. And to be honest, from a journalist's point of view, with Spurs at the moment, we're just sort of waiting really on the Europa League and how far they can go. For him to sort of dig himself out the mire. At the moment, it feels like if he can't turn it around, they go out to Frankfurt, I would expect at that point for him may struggle to stay in his job. And there's been a lot of talk about Antonio Rola. He's definitely someone that the Spurs hierarchy like, along with Marco Silva, and the potential to make a change after such a difficult season, even though there has been an understanding over the injuries this year. And then from a fan's point of view, it's hard to tell at times, because on social media at least, the most sort of negative fans are the ones that shout the loudest. But I am getting a sense that from a temperature check across the sort of Spurs fan base, that there's a frustration with Postecoglou this year and patience running out. But obviously that can still be turned around, you'd think, if they can go all the way in the Europa League. But that seems a long way to go on that front. I mean, he also was asked about sort of reflecting on this season, and he again, another admission. He said the start of the season, basically they probably got it wrong, in that they went too hard at the start of the season. He didn't really sort of explain exactly what he meant by that, but I'm presuming he meant sort of physically the numbers the team was posting in the early weeks of the season, which was so high from a pressing point of view, were perhaps too much, and led to, with the massive grueling fixture list that was to come, contributed to key players getting injured, and then the team sort of being up against it, and Ange being up against it, and trying to sort of patch up his team ahead of every game, and the relentlessness of it. And if he could do it again, he'd change it. He said he'd go a bit softer. It'd be interesting to sort of speak to him and get him to elaborate a bit more what he thought about that, because there's been a lot of talk about his training methods or his style of play, adding to muscle injuries and contributing in that way. And this felt, whilst he's always pushed back on that suggestion, this felt like it was maybe a bit of a different change of tack on that. It's interesting when you look at it. I mean, whether you're talking about pre-season or not. Remember, Spurs at the end of last season decided to go on a post-season friendly to Australia to play Newcastle. Admittedly, they just had a season where they barely played. They only played 41 games. And Ange, I remember asking him at the time, and he said if this was a normal season when they're playing in Europe, they never would have done it. But he was on board with it at the time. But when he's now talking about how players not getting a real break, it does probably stick in the craw a little bit when you think of them playing that post-season friendly and how necessary that was, if that has contributed to any kind of struggles, physically from the team, and had this snowball effect this season. But that was interesting that he talked about Mr. Hindsight before, but here he was saying in hindsight he would have done things differently. Now on to the financial results and sort of Daniel Levy's comments about it. So a lot of numbers have come out. First of all, revenue's down by 4%, down to 528 million. That's generally understood to be due to lack of no Europe last season. Wages was a big drop. That was really interesting. Went down to 22 million. That's a drop of 12%. It's now 42% of income overall, which is down 4%. That is an interesting figure because when it comes to the criticism of the ownership and the transfer policy they've gone for, a lot has been pointed to the wages they spend and compared to their competitors. And I'll come on to that and how I feel about that in a minute. Player sale profits are up 431%, 82 million. I presume that's because of Kane's sale. Daniel Levy himself had a pay rise, up 147 grand for the year, up to 3.7 million he earns a year from the club in his position, which I'll let the supporters make their own mind up about that, whether it's deserved or not. But that's the fact. That's what he's done. And so let's talk about some of his comments. He said he will not compromise the financial stability of the club. He said since opening the stadium in 2019, they spent £700 million on signings, and they must ensure we make smart purchases. He also said that he often reads calls for us to spend more, given we're ranked the ninth richest club in the world. But however, a closer examination of the financial figures reveals such spending must be sustainable in the long term and within the operating revenues. And then he went on to sort of defend the club's decision to use the stadium for multi-purpose, with all the NFL games and the rugby, and then obviously the boxing and the Beyonce concerts, which, to be honest, I don't have as much of a problem with. I think it's quite smart, but it's the first thing that people will use as a kind of way to take the mick out of a club when it's not going well. But with the current sort of PSR rules, I don't think it's actually that. I think it's not a bad way of going about things to try and to generate revenue in that way. So I'm not going to criticise him for that. But what I think you can criticise him for is this line about we must ensure we make smart purchases, because when you look at the signings, that £700 million being spent since 2019, I think there's a lot of evidence of not so much smart purchases, and that's where I think Spurs their problems have come from, really, in the last few years. Buying the wrong players. Now, the whole argument about wages, spending less on wages, massively comes into that. Perhaps they're not spending enough on wages. They might be spending enough on transfer fees, but the wages aren't high enough to attract the best players. There's definitely an argument on that front. But when you look at the money being spent on players, I look at this list compared to other players, other clubs, and I don't really see a sort of lack of ambition in terms of transfer fees, just the wrong kind of signings. So, Ndombele, top of the list, 55 million. That's been an awful signing, one of the worst in Premier League history. Massive wages, had to pay him off in the end. Really, really poor. In fact, there's a few players they've ended up having to pay off, which has underlined their poor recruitment. That year, Lo Celso, that was another miss as well, 27 million. Bergwijn, miss really overall. Sergio Reguilon's been a disaster of a signing, still at the club. Going to leave on a free transfer. Brian Hill, perennially on loan, 21 million. Maybe they'll get the money back. He's injured at the moment, but generally a really poor signing. Emerson Royale's already been moved to AC Milan. I think they didn't get, they got quite a lot of their money back on him, but he wasn't a success. And, looking at it, he was a dedicated professional, but probably not up to it, from a technical point of view. Then there are some hits, you would say, if you were going to sort of give it a sort of, one or the other hit or miss kind of rating per player, but I think none of them are unqualified hits. So Romero, 42.5 million, fantastic player, World Cup winner, but the question marks have come back again about how much he sort of prioritises his country over his club, even though I remember doing an interview with him back in Perth during Ange's Preseason tour where he really did go on about how I put it to him about the suggestion that he favours playing for Argentina over Spurs, and he really pushed back on it, and yet this latest transfer international window, he comes off after 70 minutes playing against Fulham and plays 2 sets of 90 minutes against Brazil and Uruguay. And whilst he'd probably argue that I'm finally fit to play 90 minutes, it's just the coincidence of it won't go down well with Spurs fans and will make them once again question where his loyalties lie, I suppose. And there's been a lot of talk about Atletico Madrid and a move away, and it feels like that's where we're heading on that front. So I guess if they can get a profit out of him, if they do sell him, then it will be a hit. But again, maybe not a completely unqualified one. I say Dejan Kulusevski probably on this list has been a massive hit for 25 million. Great business. Bentancur, injury and suspension have sort of meant that he's had fits and starts since he's been there. He's a wonderful player, I think, and I can see what they're trying to get him to sign a new contract. But it's not like it's been, again, an unqualified success. Basuma, apart from those first 6 weeks under Ange, where he was fantastic, he's overall been poor. Richarlison, bit different. He's just been injured way too much. I actually think Spurs have really missed him this season. I think he's played really well under Ange, much better than he did under Conte. but he's overall, you got to say it's been a poor signing given the outlay because of his unavailability. Porro overall has probably been pretty good, but for 40 minutes, still a lot of money. He's very good going forward, but defensively has been suspect at times. Maddison, for 40 million, I think he's been a good signing. But again, to go to that next level, his consistency is something that's come into question. Van der Ven, brilliant player, but injured so much that it's been obviously frustrating. Overall, you'd like to think he'd be a really good signing for 35, 36 million, but again, on the treatment table too much. Brennan Johnson, 47.5 million. I think there's question marks. Jury's out still on that being a good bit of business. For Spurs, Dragazin, 25 million, similar for him. He's obviously injured at the moment, hasn't had many games where he's really, really impressed. Archie Gray looks like a good bit of business for 40 million. I think he's going to be a top player. But still, at 40 million is a lot. So he's still got it all to prove, I suppose, but has been really fitted in brilliantly for Spurs this season, and when called upon at centre-back for 18, it's been amazing. Solanke overall, I think, even for 65 million, I think he's been really good, a really clever signing. Odobert, obviously, been injured most of the season. And then there are other signings that are not in that list. That's the biggest signings the Spurs have made since the opening of the stadium, but people like Bergvall for 12.5 million, I think it was, or maybe 8.5, been a really, really good signing. So there have been some good recruitment, definitely, but I think there have been too many misses, and that's where I think Spurs' problems have laid. I mean, you just look at Newcastle and some of the signings they've made since being taken over, and they've just got it spot on with Isak and Livramento and Guimaraes and Tonali, even though he was suspended for a long time. They're really good purchases, and it just shows you the difference, particularly in this PSR age. You've just got to get it right, and that's where Spurs really need to improve overall, I think. Anyway, that's kind of my take on it. And whilst I totally understand a lot of the criticism towards Levy and the club, and the season's been an absolute disaster, barring possible salvation for the Europa League, I think they've got to do better in the recruitment, and maybe part of that is spending more on wages. That's my main issue. But let me know what you think. Whether that's sort of missing the point, whether it's way more than that or not, I don't know. Let me know, and I'll speak to you again soon. Cheers, guys.